The story is told about the Kerry man. Kerry is a part of Ireland, and we do often tell stories about the Kerry man. No harm intended, and there was no Kerry man injured in the making of this story either. He was on holidays or vacation in London, and he saw this Baptist preacher down at the banks of the River Thames as he went for a walk. And he was curious about what was going on, so he went closer to find out what the preacher was saying. And there was a number of people around him that came to him, and they would ask the preacher what he was doing, and he would ask them, "Do you want to be saved?" And they would say, "Yes, I do." And he would place his hands behind their head and push their hand under the water of the river for a moment, and then take them out and ask, "Did you find Jesus?" And they would say, "Yes, I did." And they were saved. That worked fine until it came to the Kerry man's turn. And he said, "Do you want to be saved?" And the Kerry man said, "Yes." And he placed his head gently under the water and took it out again, and he said, "Did you find Jesus?" And he said, "No." So again, he placed his head under the water again for a little longer and took out his head and said, "Did you find Jesus?" And again, the Kerry man said, "No." Now the preacher man was a little bit perplexed. His reputation was on the line. So he pushed his head down a third time. In this time he waited until the bubbles nearly stopped. And he took out the Kerry man's head and said, "Did you find Jesus?" To which the Kerry man replied, "Are you sure he fell in here?" You see, the Kerry man in that little story just wanted to be involved. Have you ever felt like that, wanting to be involved? Maybe finding yourself to be a little bit out of your depth? If you are, then you're in good company, because that's the kind of person that Simon Peter was. He missed many great opportunities to say nothing, but he said something. And sometimes he planted his foot right between his cheeks. He also missed several great opportunities to be still, but he moved. You might remember when he brought the coin to Jesus and asked, "Should we pay our taxes?" And Jesus asked, "Whose head is on the coin?" And he said, "Caesar." And he said, "Well, give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." But you see, this was part of Peter's nature. Sometimes he just had to do something. Today, like that Kerry man, he almost drowned. You know the story. It takes place immediately after Jesus has fed the 5,000. Jesus still hadn't had an opportunity to grieve the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. So after feeding the 5,000, he sends his disciples away to the other side of the river. And he said, "I'll dismiss the 5,000 that are here." And he said, then he did that, and then he went up the mountain to pray. Shortly before dawn, having been in communion with the Father, Jesus went to where the disciples were, and as St. Matthew tells us, he got there walking across the water. The disciples must have been terrified. It's a ghost, they thought. We wouldn't blame them. Ordinary people can't walk on water. Of course, this minor episode in Jesus' life became the source of many stories. The story is time-honoured, is told about the Scottish man who was taking a trip in the Holy Land. The people from Scotland were renowned for being very financially astute, careful with their funds. So when he arrived at the Sea of Galilee, he was completely aghast to find out that it cost $50 to hire a little boat for an hour to go on the Sea of Galilee. So he said to the man who was renting out the boats, he said, if I was in Scotland, I could rent that boat for $20. To which the boatman said, "But you have to take into account you're at the Sea of Galilee. This is the water on which the Lord Jesus walked." And the Scotsman replied, "Well, at $50 an hour to rent a boat, it's no surprise that he walked." Today, Jesus walked on the water. The disciples were afraid. Jesus tried to calm them. "Do not be afraid, it is I." And of course, it's Simon Peter who speaks up, "If it is you, tell me to come to you across the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Matthew tells us that Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. I can imagine Peter thinking to himself, "Wow, this is great. Look at me. I'm really doing it. I'm walking on water." But Simon Peter felt the wind beginning to pick up, and suddenly he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, "Jesus, save me." And Jesus reached out straight away and saved him. I could imagine there was a big smile on Jesus' face as he said, "You of little faith, why did you fear?" Matthew tells us that those who were in the boat worshipped. They worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are Son of God." Yes, Jesus is the Son of God. That is why we're here. That's why we gather each Sunday so faithfully in God's presence. Sometimes you have to just become involved. That was what St. Peter did. You'll notice that his two friends never got their feet wet. James and John, the sons of thunder, renowned for their courage, they had stayed in the boat, but Peter had wanted some action. Becoming involved in things maybe isn't always that wise. That was the advice of Dr. Robert Sims, who told of a retired man here in California who made the news headlines some years ago. It seems that he decided to tie some helium balloons to his garden chair and take a ride. After tying several balloons to the chair, it started to lift off the ground, so he got his friends to hold it down while he tied on another 30 or 40 balloons onto it. And then he got into the chair and strapped himself in and told his friends to let go. He expected that the chair would fly up maybe 10 or 15 feet, and he had a sharp pointed stick to burst the balloons and he could have a nice, safe landing. That's what he thought until he flew across Los Angeles airport at 3,500 feet, and the air traffic control had to go and get him. Maybe the guy in the chair wasn't so wonderfully wise, but he was certainly having a go. That was his excuse. You just have to do something. And sometimes we do. I believe that that's what Jesus saw as so lovable in Simon Peter. He wasn't the kind of individual to sit around and reflect on things. He was the kind of man who acted first and considered the consequences later. That sometimes got him into trouble, but at least he lived by his convictions. At least he was in the water where the action was, and that's refreshing. Most of us, as followers of the Lord, tend to be highly cautious people, not trying to step out of the boat. The existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once described the decision to follow Jesus as a leap of faith, like jumping off a cliff. Maybe that is why so few of us are to follow Jesus as radically as we could. We're not into cliff jumping. We're not just that adventurous. You know, it's true, we're good people, nice people, sweet people. We wouldn't hurt a fly. We were brought up to respect the rights of others. We keep the commandments as best we can. We mightn't have many major vices. The question is, do we have many major virtues? Notice that it was only really when Peter took his eyes off Jesus that he began to sink. That's how following Jesus sometimes works. As long as we're focused on our faith, all is right. When we focus on our fears, that's when the trouble can start. If I was to take a 10-foot long plank and put it on the floor down along the main aisle and asked if anybody wanted to walk the plank, I'm sure there would be no shortage of volunteers. If, however, I was to suspend that plank 50 feet from the ground, it might be more difficult to get people willing to walk the plank. Our consciousness of our circumstances can sometimes overwhelm us. Our confidence about walking the plank could change. That, of course, is what happened to St. Peter. He suddenly became aware of the wind, of the waves, of the depth of water beneath his feet. He became nervous and suddenly realized the absurdity of his circumstances and began to panic. If Jesus had not been there, what might have happened? Sometimes something similar can happen in our church or our parish involvement. You know, where a group of people have a dream for their church and they begin to believe that this dream is from God. They believe they're following Jesus, and soon they have a plan. A winning and a beautiful future unfolds before them. It begins to take shape. But then the inevitable happens. There's opposition in the parish. It'll bankrupt the church, some say. And I understand Mr. So-and-so is against it, and if he leaves the parish, he'll take his money with him and we'll be in trouble. Suddenly, support begins to falter and disappears altogether. A well-known bishop once said that most churches will die of boredom before they die of controversy. So then what does today's scriptures encourage us to do? Today's scriptures encourage us to become involved, to do something, to dare to dream, maybe to become involved in something in the parish that scares us a little bit, but to take on that challenge. If our focus is the Lord, nothing can go wrong. So today we're encouraged to take and place our feet outside the boat, to walk on the water. The Lord will show us the steps. Amen.